For those of you who do not know Kathleen, she's literally written the book on Parricide. In fact, she's brought some copies of the book, Understanding Parricide, When Sons and Daughters Kill Their Parents. As I mentioned, she's a full professor at the University of South Florida, which is in Tampa, and she's a leading authority around the world in juvenile homicide. She's written widely on the topic. She's, in fact, has 4 books, and a couple of them on this topic, and the most recent one from Oxford University Press, which is published in 2013. And it represents 3 decades of research and clinical evaluation of parricide. So she's in very high demand, both as a speaker, but also as a consultant. She does work for the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Justice. She's in high demand for court cases as well as an expert witness. She's also a licensed mental health professional and, as I said, a court-appointed expert witness. So we're very pleased to welcome Professor Heide here to Brisbane and to this conference. And I'll turn the floor over to her. Thank you, Kathleen.
Good morning. It's truly an honor for me to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Mazerol and Dr. Thomason and also Nicola, who's done so much to bring me over here today. And I'm very excited. I got in yesterday about 5:30 in the morning, and I took some time to go on the Brisbane River by ferry and had a wonderful time. Went through the gardens and then ate dinner on Eagle Street overlooking the bridge. It's just been a marvelous time. So even though I've been here 26 hours, I'm on your time. So I went to bed early, and I'm just very pumped to have this opportunity. So I'm going to talk to you in the next, I think, about half an hour or so on my research, which, as Dr. Mazerol said, goes back about 30 years. And I'll do my best to stay in that time frame. So a little bit about how I became involved in knowing so much about this topic, why kids kill parents. And I'll just mention that I've analyzed nearly 10,000 cases of individuals, sons and daughters, who've killed parents. And it's over a 32-year period. Now, I got that data. The U.S. has a national data set which made it possible for me to do this. And so I've analyzed data submitted voluntarily by law enforcement to the FBI. Then, in addition, I've consulted on countless cases in the U.S. and abroad, and I personally evaluated over 40 individuals who killed parents. Most of them have been adolescents and young adults, and I've evaluated those individuals in 12 states in the United States and in Canada. Now, what I'm going to do in the next 35 minutes is to go into what is parricide, so we all have a good sense of that. How common is it? And then I'll talk about some very basic characteristics of parricide offenders. Then what I want to do is get to the question that is asked probably by you, it's asked by the media, it's asked in every case. Why would someone kill a mother, a father, possibly both, a whole family? And then we'll look at what characteristics are associated with 4 parricide offender types. I've identified through my research and clinical practice 4 pathways or 4 motivational dynamics why individuals kill parents, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to talk very briefly about what happens in the United States when particularly young people kill parents, and I will finish up with can parricide be predicted, and then also just a little bit, hopefully, on prevention and risk factors. All right, so what is parricide? I'm going to start off with the case of Terry Adams, one of the first cases I ever had, because I think most of us relate to people and episodes. So let me just use this case. This was a boy who was born to 2 alcoholic parents. He was the 3rd child in the family, and from the time he was very, very little, he was abused physically, verbally, and psychologically by both of his parents. Now, when the girls got to the age of 18, they left the family home. One got married, one went to college, leaving Terry as the sole object of abuse in that home. At the age of 16, Terry decided he was just going to leave home. got the sense it wasn't working. And so his father, as parents often do, got a sense something was up. And he confronted Terry. And he said, Terry, you're not thinking of running away, are you? And Terry said, yeah, Dad, I am. And his father said, Terry, you can't leave home. You can't run away. How are you going to support yourself? You can't quit school. And Terry said to me, and corroboration, of course, is important to the extent you can do that. And Terry said to me, I was raised with respect. I knew not to argue with my dad. So I said, okay, Dad. You're right, Dad. You're right, Dad. Forget it. I won't. In the middle of the night, Terry got up and he grabbed some jeans and he put them in a paper bag. And the house was under construction. So what Terry had to do to get out of the house was literally to walk through his parents' bedroom. So in the middle of the night, he's walking through his parents' bedroom. His parents were sound asleep. And his father wakes up and he sees the silhouette of Terry, gets out of bed, and he slugs Terry. And Terry said, I would not hit my dad. So he said, I put up my hands to fend off the blows. And he said, and I fell back into the closet where there were a number of firearms. And he said, I remember grabbing the rifle, and he trained it on his dad. And then he said he heard a loud noise. And then the next thing he remembered was looking over at the bed. And his mother had awakened, and she was sitting up in the bed. And I'll never forget the words, what he said to me. He said what he saw as he looked at his mom was the agony within the terror. And he took the rifle, trained it on her, and he said the next thing he remembered, another loud shot. He saw the two dead bodies. No question he was the one that did that. He went outside, smoked a cigarette, and he called the police. Police arrived. Terry was arrested. He was charged as an adult, 16 years old, charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Now, what subsequent investigation revealed, and this is corroborated, is that there had been several petitions for neglect and abuse filed in this home. And they had been founded, which in the United States means that there had been sufficient evidence. And Terry, on 3 occasions, had actually been removed from this home. On one occasion, he lived with foster care, the other times with his sister. Social services were in this house, and they successfully closed the case as a successful event. And within 10 months of closing that investigation as a success, Mr. and Mrs. Adams were dead, and Terry was charged, as I said, with 2 counts of murder. On advice of counsel, Terry pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 2 counts of life in prison. So that's one of the first cases I had that bothered me and got me involved in looking at these cases. Now, just for the record, parricide means the killing of a close relative, but it's become increasingly common in the U.S. and abroad to mean the killing of a parent. Now, patricide, you probably know, particularly if you had Latin when I was a kid, they taught us this. What does patricide mean? Somebody's got to know this. Killing of a what? Father, good. And matricide, killing of a mother, exactly. And familicide is the killing of a whole family unit, mother, father, and often siblings. I had a case not too long ago where a prosecutor flew up with his team, and it involved a 12-year-old boy. He was 65 pounds, 70 at most, and he was a church boy, never been in trouble, and they use that word, church boy, very involved in the church. He shot his mother and his father. Shot and killed mother, father. He shot his little brother, who was 9 and a little boy, meaning stature, little. And when he didn't die, he stabbed him. And then he ran out of bullets, and he had a little 5-year-old sister who was tiny by all standards, and he slit her throat. Now, miraculously, the brother and the sister lived. The physicians didn't expect them to, but miraculously they did. So the prosecutor's question to me, and he said to me, Dr. Heide, if this individual was 25 years old, I would not care why he did it. But he's 12 years old and I have to make a decision whether to prosecute him as an adult, to transfer him to an adult court, and to prosecute him, and in the laws at that time would have meant, it was a couple of years ago, that he would have spent the rest of his natural life in prison. So that was the reason for the inquiry. All right, so how common is it? I feel a little embarrassed when I talk about the statistics in our country because the statistics that Dr. Thomason went through for Australia, we would love to have those statistics. We have an average of 250 parents killed each year. You're talking about a total of 246 the last year. We do that in parents alone. Our homicide rate, though down, is about 15,000. Now, I just want to put this in a context. Fortunately, parricide is a rare event. Not all countries report statistics, but those who do that I could find, we're looking at between 2 and 5%. And Australia, fortunately, is again in that low percentage. But again, the numbers are significantly lower than ours. All right, some of the basic characteristics. These cases I just pulled out because they got a lot of attention in our country. A little girl up there, Valessa Robinson, 15 years old, killed her mother. By all accounts, a lovely woman. Got a lot of attention because she was a female. She killed with her boyfriend and another boy. Some of these good-looking guys down there, they got a lot of attention worldwide. Does anybody recognize them? Holly, do you recognize them? You're smiling. I thought maybe you did. Menendez brothers. Yeah, two rich kids that killed their parents in Beverly Hills, California. And then the other one up in the right-hand corner, you probably have heard the Amityville Horror. That is Ronnie DeFeo, who killed his mother, father, two younger sisters, and two younger brothers. So a total of 6 people. Now, I put those cases out because often what they represent are cases that get a great deal of media attention. However, they're not the norm, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes here. And I'll also mention in the U.S., parricide is a very stable phenomenon. It hasn't changed over the 30 years that I've looked at. In other words, the demographics are very very stable. All right, most important thing is most parents are slain in single-victim, single-offender incidents, meaning a son or daughter kills a mother or father. And most are killed by adult children. The ones that get the most attention are the 12-year-olds and the 15-year-olds and the 17-year-olds. In our country, this is important because this would not be true in homicide in general. Most victims and offenders are white, disproportionately so. And most offenders, 85% or so, are males. And this is something that stands out dramatically from Australia and many countries, is most victims are killed by firearms. And when we're talking about juveniles, significantly more likely to use firearms to kill their parents. All right, some of you may know this case. Lizzie Borden, anybody have any recognition, killed her stepmother and father over 100 years ago. Still gets a lot of attention. But I just want to point out female parricide offenders are less than 20% of the killers in single-victim, single-offender incidents. And when we look at multiple offenders like the Menendez brothers, very rare. So fewer than 10% of parricide victims are killed by offspring acting with an accomplice, a sibling or someone else. And then double parricides, mother and father slain, or familicides, when the whole family unit is destroyed, exceedingly uncommon. And we're looking about 8% of all parents killed by their offspring involve multiple parents in the U.S. And that's over a 30-year period. So again, very consistent. Now I'm just going to go through this briefly. Age I think is an interesting point to look at. And if you look at under 18, in the United States, we consider juveniles as individuals who are under 18. You're looking at about 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 parricide offenders, or those who kill dads, are under 18. Mothers, it's about 1 out of 7. But if you take it a little bit more into the late teens, or say to 2024, where a lot of kids or young adults are still living at home, you'll find that it goes up to about half of fathers are slain by those 24 and under, and then with mothers, it's about a third. Now, I highlight that because two reasons. One is because oftentimes young adults are still living at home, and then research on the adolescent brain shows that the brain is not fully developed 23 to 25, and the last area of the brain to develop is the higher cortical areas associated with deliberation, judgment, and reasoning. All right, so the question, why do kids kill their parents? I'm going to briefly go over this. In '92, I identified 3 types based on the literature and some of my cases. And then in 2013, based on what I had learned and what others had seen, I retained the 3 types, and then I added a 4th type I call the enraged parasite offender. And those are the types that I'll be talking about in the next few minutes. Now, what I want to say, and I know that you know this, but just to mention it, age really does matter. And that, we have kids, little kids, probably the youngest parasite offender I'm aware of is about 4. But in terms of kids that, and I have the numbers in my book, under 10, under 12, certainly individuals that young who've killed parents. So we have childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and there are differences. Now, what every parent knows is that when you're dealing with children, they don't really understand, little kids, the concept of death. They're sort of caught up in cartoons. So if somebody's head gets shot off in a cartoon, it gets back to them in the next scene, or if they get steamrolled. So children, and we had an 8-year-old who killed his father and a boarder in the house. The question I was asked, could an 8-year-old really understand that death means forever gone, that dad's not coming back? And so little kids oftentimes do not appreciate the permanency of death and understand that you have the ability to formulate intent to commit a homicide. So these kids in our country typically are dealt with in the mental health or social services system. Then we get to adolescence, and sometimes people want to say, well, they're the equivalent. And we know that they're not because, as I mentioned, in brain development, they're not mini adults. And then often also, too, they have different options and alternatives. Adolescents who are abused and who are 14 can't simply leave the house and get a rented apartment because of contractual law. They can't quit school. They can't support themselves. And they typically have far less life experience. They don't know that, someday it'll get better. And they don't have the maturity in the average case of adults. So clearly there's a difference between adolescents who kill parents and adults. An adult living, say, in an abusive home, a healthy adult will leave that home. A 14, a 15, a 12-year-old, a 17-year-old does not have those same options. All right, now some diagnoses I'm going to mention very quickly. Certainly this is meant for modal diagnoses. PTSD is common among adolescents, depression, and conduct disorder. Those are the most common. And among adults, it varies by setting. So what we tend to see in forensic settings, and this appears to be about half or more, individuals who have schizophrenia or something along that spectrum, or major affective disorders like depression and bipolar. And then in other settings, particularly in prisons and evaluations, we see substance abuse psychosis or co-occurring alcoholism, and also personality disorders. So we certainly see not just severe mental illness. All right, so some of the characteristics associated with the 4 parasite offender types. I'm going to start with the severely abused parasite offender. This is the most common among adolescents. And by this, I mean these individuals tend to be victims of abuse. It can be several types of abuses, I'll show you. And also witnesses. They've seen their siblings being abused. Very often they've seen their moms being abused. And so the killing, so these individuals experience the terror of something awful going to happen to them, death, serious physical injury, and the horror of watching those they love victimized by one or both parents. key point. They kill in fear of their lives or in desperation. They see no other way to get out of the situation. It's not revenge. Again, it is not revenge. They're killing in fear or in desperation. They just want the abuse to end. And I mentioned the case of Terry Adams a moment ago. Now, I don't have time to go through these in depth, but when I talk about child maltreatment, I'm looking at physical abuse, sexual, and if there's time, I'll explain some of the distinctions I make there. Verbal abuse, words that wound that you'll know. Psychological abuse, behaviors or words that undermine a child's sense of self. Physical neglect, the basics we all know. Parents are supposed to provide food, clothing, and shelter. They're also supposed to provide a safe environment for their children. Supervision, and then set limits, discipline, appropriate limits. Medical neglect, emotional neglect, and then emotional incest, where a parent treats a child as though he or she were a surrogate spouse. So they expect that that child should function as an adult and almost as a partner as opposed to a child. Enormously stressful for a child. All right, so let me just give Peter, and I'll go through this quickly. But he was subjected, as we'll see, to spouse abuse, child physical abuse, verbal abuse, physical and emotional neglect, emotional incest, and it was documented. In any case, I will review the records, all the discovery records, the police reports, meet with surviving family members, look at school records, medical records, and often with teachers and others that are available. All right, he witnessed the abuse of his mom from the time he was very young. He saw his father beating his mother's head and banging it on the floor as a boy, beating her all the time. Mom was afraid of the husband, and he would say things to her like, "You don't know nothing, bitch, shut the fuck up," words that no child should hear. Mom, typical battered wife, left the home, came back, and again corroborated. Now, some of the examples of inflicted physical injury, he had bruises and welts on his back from the beatings. His father would use a stick, would sometimes draw blood. His father had kicked him and punched him in the head, witnessed. Father had pulled him up and led him by the hair on his head. He took his thumb one time and bent it back so much the boy was screaming in pain and fell on the floor. He threw objects at him. And then, as boys often do, he got to the age of 14. His dad is beating his mom. He said to his dad, and he was being, Peter from the time he was young, being beaten, but he said, "If you leave her alone, if you want somebody beat, take it out on me, leave her alone." And then the abuse became worse. He was afraid his dad might kill him. Now you can see this verbal abuse. Cuss at him and tell him you ain't worth shit, you're stupid like your goddamn mother, and you're nothing but a sorry son of a bitch, a pussy. Words that wound. Mom was unable to protect her son. I've seen this repeatedly. She had Crohn's disease, so her health was affected, and she zoned out on tranquilizers to cope. So mom is sort of in the zones, not there to help with the situation. Neither parent met his needs, and he became the parent in the house. I'll give you an example. I said to him at one point, he sent his little brother to school. So I said, "Well, Peter, you don't have a license, driver's license. How did you do that?" And he goes, "Somebody had to get him to school." So he's functioning as the parent in the house. Mom confiding, and it's like a rubber band. What happens if you take a rubber band and you just keep pulling it? What happens? Snaps. And that's about what happened with Peter. All right, so he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. If there's time to talk to you about that. He killed his dad when he was frightened that his dad, who had made threats to kill him, would kill him. All right, severely mentally ill parasite offender. This is the most common among adult offenders. And here we're looking at people who are gravely mentally ill or psychotic. Now, I've already mentioned diagnoses that are common. And these are people who are out of touch with reality. These are the kind of people that oftentimes when you see them, you recognize something is wrong with them. Their thinking is irrational. Their behavior is. And I just had a case where a kid killed his parents. A good parents, and his plan was, think of this, he said to his friends he's going to kill his parents, who were wonderful people by all accounts, kill himself, but in between events he'd have a blowout party. Long-standing history of depression and psychiatric intervention. Hallucinations, we know, maybe like in some of my cases, offenders have heard God saying, kill your parents, or Satan, and delusions, bizarre, like your mother is a KGB agent, or the mother is an imposter. That's really not my mother. That is somebody posing as my mother, and I've got to kill my mother to free my real mother to come back to me. All right, some examples, and I'll be quick here. I had a case of a boy, he was a young adult, who was living in his world, a lot of role plays in medieval times, diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic for years. His mother, oddly, against all advice, bought him swords, not stage props, real swords. He had between 15 and 17 by my count. And one day, when he was in his alternate universe, he killed her and killed the dog, stabbed the dog 17 times because the irrationality, he was trying to find the heart to put the dog out of its misery in a merciful way. Jonathan, Satan commanded him to kill his mom according to a detailed plan. Marcus, God commanded him. I already mentioned Tyler a moment ago. And then sometimes we have adults who kill who don't have a long-standing history, but they're taking care of an aging parent, becomes too much for them, and they go into what is called a psychotic depression. And in our country, of course, this probably is true in many countries, it's not necessarily a bar to prosecution, provided the individual can assist counsel in his defense and knows what's going on. And then we get to the dangerously antisocial. These are people who have a continuous pattern of disregarding the rights of others. Diagnosis, as you may have heard of, conduct disorder, under 18, antisocial personality disorder. And further along the continuum is psychopathic personality, someone who has emotional deficits, callous, remorseless, cunning, manipulative. Further along, and nihilistic killer, individuals who enjoy acts of destructiveness. In some cases of serial murderers, interestingly, their first victims have been parents. Again, underscoring the importance of assessment. So what have I had? I've had cases of kids who've killed for freedom, parents closing in on their wild lifestyle, coming in after not disciplining them, and then the kids killing in a very well-known case in the U.S., they were neo-Nazi kids, meaning they were into neo-Nazi activities. They were mean, they were drinking, parents were going to hospitalize them. They got wind of it, killed mother, father, and little brother. I've had several cases, this shocks people, but of girls who've killed for love. Boys don't seem to do that. But girls, they were going to be separated from their man or the boy of their dream, killed their parents. And several cases of money. This tended to be adults. Parents had bankrolled them for years, sort of the ne'er-do-well kids, or now grown-ups. Parents cut it off. That's it, John. We're not bankrolling you anymore. And then killed, essentially, so that they would have their parents' money. Now, I just say this quickly because I want to make sure that we have time. I think we're doing all right on time, right? Okay, good. They appear neat and clean, but assessment is really critical. I had a case of a young girl killed her dad. Very interesting case. She was sexually abused, or physically sexually abused verbally, and the question was, she got her friends involved, and the prosecutor in the case was, this is at a time when we had the death penalty for juveniles. The prosecutor's goal was to get her, the youngest person on death row. And when I came into the case, it appeared based on the facts, because the girl had talked about killing her parents, got her friends involved in the killing, and then had a party afterwards. Everybody thought, well, this kid is really evil and no good. And it turned out she was a very limited kid who had been severely abused, was desperate to end the abuse, found no other way out, and engaged her friends to help. So kids who are abused may adopt an antisocial way of responding to life. What is determinative is what propelled the homicide, not necessarily a history of acting out. All right, and then, since some of you know the Menendez case, and I won't spend too much time here, but the question in that case was always framed to me this way. Were those boys, and those boys were 18 and 21, by the way, but were those young men, were they really abused, or were they psychopaths? Just kids who killed, as the state alleged, because they wanted to hasten their inheritance of $14 million. And my point in that case is they're not mutually exclusive. It's possible to be abused and then to become dangerously antisocial. So again, I just want to underscore that a history of acting out, you've got to see what the character is of that individual. And it is indeed possible that some individuals who are raised in abusive homes may develop conduct disorder and become antisocial. Also, just very briefly, I've had several cases of parents who were not abusive, anything but were overindulgent. They didn't set limits. And the problem is when kids don't set limits, at some point, often what happens is parents will say, my son or daughter is out of control, and I need to do something. So now they're going to come in and try to rein in an out-of-control child, and on some occasions that has led to homicidal rage. And so that's an important thing to look at in every case. So the critical question, and if I give you one thing to take away, this is it. What propelled the homicide? That's the critical question in determining the type. And then a possible fourth type, the enraged parasite offender. Here the killing is reactive to deep-seated rage that erupts later. And I'll give you a case of Carl. Carl was a kid. He had a sister. He loved his sister. She was sexually abused by their father. It was corroborated, so the parents, Carl went to live with his dad. The girl went to live with the mother. And Carl became, after this, a different kid. Got into a lot of trouble. He was basically what we'd call conduct disorder, breaking the law, doing drugs. And finally, one day, he decides with his friends they're going to steal a car, and they're going to go to another state. There's one problem. They don't know how to steal a car. So they, after several foiled attempts, they go back to Carl's house. They're smoking dope in the living room. Parents are asleep. And then Carl goes in several times and says he's going to take his dad's car. So he goes into the bedroom to get the keys. He does that a couple of times. Father wakes up and goes, what are you doing in here? And he says, I just came in for a cigarette. Then another time he said something else. And then, so finally he comes out. He's tried twice now. Father's basically told him to get out of his room. He's in there with his fiancée. And then what Carl does is he says, we can't do it. And one of the boys says to him, why don't you kill your father? He goes, I'm not going to kill my father. And then the kid says, remember what he did to your sister. And that reference to the abuse. And all witness accounts were, and this was in deposition, sworn testimony, the look on his face just changed, become almost like deranged. He grabbed the gun, he went in, shot his dad, and he killed his dad, and then they fled and were subsequently apprehended. He was, by the way, convicted of first-degree murder, but again, what led to that was the rage. All right, I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. If there is time, I'll come back to it. All right, how does the legal system in the U.S. deal with this? This is important to me because I don't think it's the same way in all countries. Kids in the U.S., in most cases, will, even if they're young as 12 years old, will be processed as adults, typically charged with first or second degree murder, premeditated or killing because of reckless endangerment. The defenses used will be typically insanity or battered child. They rarely work, and if there's time, we'll talk about why. They're typically convicted of a lesser charge, And then there's a sentencing hearing, and there's normally factors that are introduced in mitigation, which may cause the judge not to impose the maximum if the judge has that choice. Now they do. For a while, and I'll come back to that, if the child was convicted of first-degree murder, the sentence might be mandatory. And factors that are brought out typically is the age of the child, the history of child maltreatment, which can further affect the child's ability to reason. And then, as we know, those who are parents know that children are more impulsive, and when highly charged situation, more likely to operate out of the limbic system of the brain. And then they have not abused kids learn to modulate that as well as children growing up in healthy environments. And then there can be long-term changes in the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine responses to stress so that kids remain on hyper alert. So that can be brought out. The diagnosis we've already talked about. These kids typically, the severely abused, have minimal or no criminal history. All right, what happens? They often serve time in adult prison. They can still be sentenced. Now, we've had a lot of changes in the laws, and if you want, I'll go through this in the question and answer. 2012, our highest court, the U.S. Supreme Court, ruled that juveniles could not be sentenced to mandatory, that's the key, mandatory life without parole for first-degree murder, that a sentencing hearing had to be held. But after the sentencing hearing, the juvenile could be sentenced to life without parole. And I was involved in a case last week where a juvenile was sentenced to life without parole. The boy I talked about who wanted to kill his parents, kill himself, and have the blowout party was sentenced to life without parole. Treatment is often ordered by the judges, but typically not available in prison. Can it be predicted? And the answer is no, because it's a low base rate phenomenon. Even though we have 250 cases a year, that's 2%. So you're trying to predict something that is extremely rare, impossible. Risk factors can be identified, and if there's time, I'll go into those, particularly for the severely abused. But I wanted to underscore that homicidal threats should always be taken seriously. I've had several cases of kids who killed parents who've talked to their friends. They've said, I'm thinking of killing my dad, I'm thinking of killing my mom, and the kids thought they were joking. Sometimes even played along, oh yeah, well, I'll help you kill your old man. You know, when kids are talking about stuff like that, it could be a test balloon, a warning signal, but it clearly should be dealt with, not like Johnny will never do it. And in the cases I've had, I had a case, in fact, in Canada. When the parents were dead, it wasn't a whodunit. Everybody said, well, what do I call him in the book? Daniel did it. I mean, because he talked about it, and everybody just humored him. And the sad thing is maybe that could have been prevented. All right, in prevention, I talked about several things, and I'm talking about the prototypical case. 5 minutes? Okay, good. Interventions in cases of suspected abuse, where people are often reluctant to get involved. Very important. I talk about helping parents. We think most parents know how to be good parents, but that's if you come from a healthy family. So parental support and education, and even going into the school system and teaching kids about healthy parenting, child abuse, and how to get help. Now, what I talked about in my first book, and this has now become something that's in some of our schools, is the immediate availability of a supportive network. So when the child is being abused, there's somebody in the school, not a guidance counselor, because in our country, typically guidance counselors are dealing with academic matters, and they don't have the time. There aren't enough of them. So somebody they could go to and talk to and say, things aren't good at my house, and get help, and if need be, then get into the system. The media can do a great deal in terms of public service announcements and also helping individuals understand what abuse is, particularly things like emotional and verbal abuse. And then mental health services for all types, certainly individuals who are severely mentally ill, but even individuals who are acting out need help, and then the severely abused need help. This has been a problem in the U.S. where there are not adequate mental health services, and we struggle with this with insurance. All right, I'm going to close here, and then I think we'll have time for questions. And I'm going to go back to Terry Adams in just a moment. But with child abuse, we know, and there's so much research, you all know this, that it can lead to mental and physical disorders. That's not new. And it can also, in some cases, lead to human carnage, where individuals get killed, as in moms and dads, and sometimes other family members, and the death of the human spirit. And I want to close with the words Terry Adams said to me many years ago. He said, the biggest thing, now he was a boy of about 16, I think, at this time, maybe a little older. The biggest thing is just being aware, care, because if you don't, it's just not the little kid you are hurting. You are hurting tomorrow. Because kids are defenseless. They don't have the vocabulary, the mental capacity, the mentality, the strong points to stand up. If somebody won't stand up for them, nobody will. If no one does, then what's tomorrow? So I think that his words are probably more powerful than anything else that I could say right now. So I want to thank you for your kind attention. And Paul, if there's time, I would love to take questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Please.
Is this working? No?
It doesn't sound like
I'll
it.
shout.
Okay.
I simply wanted to ask you to expand upon the proposition you advanced that insanity defences rarely work in the United States.
Rarely work. Yes, sir.
We have a system here that's quite different, I gather, from most other places, perhaps including the United States, that diverts mental cases to a separate court. But can you expand upon your...
Yes, and I'm very grateful for the question. We have some diversity of insanity tests in the United States. One comes from England, McNaughton, which is law in about 50% of our states. And that is, it's a very, very strict standard. And it means that an individual has a mental disorder, so you must have the mental disorder. And it must be such that it's led to a cognitive defect, so a mental defect, such that the offender did not know what he was doing, meaning that he was killing the parent, so he didn't know, like when he shot, that he was shooting and that could result in the death, or he didn't know it was wrong. And wrong is typically defined in most states as against the law. So if the offender knew that he was killing his mother or father, say he has a mental disease like paranoid schizophrenia or major depression with psychotic features, if he knew that he was killing his parents and he knew it was wrong, as in the case of Tyler, then under our standards of law, he would be found to be sane. And so that is one of the issues. And then there's another standard, and that's the federal rule. And some of you remember, if you're old enough or you have a sense of U.S. history, you may remember when President Reagan was shot. That goes back to the early 80s. He fortunately lived. And the jury at the time, because of the insanity law, it was a different version. In that jurisdiction, it was the ALI standard. He was acquitted under the law because the jury found that he lacked substantial capacity to appreciate what he was doing and to know it was wrong. He wanted to kill President Reagan essentially because he wanted to impress an actress. Some of you will know Jodie Foster. So he thought this was the way to win her heart, right? You kill the President of the United States. What could be more compelling for a woman to fall in love with you? So the jury had said, yeah, it's bizarre, right? So the jury found that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. And then the legislature changed the law, the federal standard, to make it more exacting. So over time what's happened, and it's an excellent question, the laws, it's very difficult for an individual in the U.S. to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Not to say it never happens, but it's probably about 1%. And where it's more likely to be found not guilty by reason of insanity is in minor things like a trespass or a burglary. But when you're dealing with when we're dealing with murder in our country, it's very difficult for an individual, not impossible, but very difficult for an individual found not guilty by reason of insanity. Excellent question. Thank you.
Kathleen, can I ask?
Yes, please.
Who makes the decision and what are the criteria for deciding if a child is dealt with as an adult?
Very good question. Typically, well, it depends on the state, but typically it's made by the prosecutor. Now, particularly if the child is of a certain age. So let me just tell you that every state of our 50 states has mechanisms to get children into adult court. Sometimes they have more than one. So in some states, it's grand jury indictment, and that can be at any age, as young as 7 in some states. Some states, like New York, have written into their statutes that for murder, for example, a child at 13 years of age who commits a homicide will automatically be dealt with as an adult. And then in some cases, it's the prosecutor that the laws say if you are of a certain age and it's a serious felony will be prosecuted. So it's very common. What is actually rare, and I really appreciate the question, is for a juvenile who commits murder in the U.S. not to be treated as an adult. It happens sometimes, but it's actually quite rare if we're talking about a child 12 or over. Now, the case I mentioned that got so much attention, the case in Arizona, that was an 8-year-old boy, and he was, in fact, prosecuted as an adult. All of my cases, with the exception of one, have been prosecuted as adults, and my cases go back to 12. One case is where I was consulted by a judge. The judge decided to keep a girl who attempted to kill her mom. Fortunately, she was not successful, but the judge kept her in juvenile court. Long history substantiated of abuse, and I think a major factor was, fortunately, the victim didn't die, so it gives the judge a little bit more latitude. Excellent question. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it.
Just one quick question.
Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence at all of a link between exposure to violent video games and parricide?
Excellent question. Thank you, sir. Let me tell you my experience. I deal not only with parricide, but I deal with kids who kill in general. So my conclusions are it's never one factor. However, I do think that violent video games, if used excessively, can have an effect. So it would be something in in sort of the mix. And I say that because, I could think of some actual cases, but if you have a child who is depressed, who's alienated, now I'm talking more about juvenile homicide, but I'll bring it back to parricide if you want. You have a child who's depressed, it's usually a he, is alienated. He doesn't have a girlfriend. He's not playing sports. He's not doing well in school. And he spends the majority of his time absorbed in violent imagery. What can happen is you go from sort of the fantasy, I want to get at those people that have harmed me, those kids that bully me, and you go from the fantasy stage to the acting out of it and the blending sometimes of fantasy and reality. And then sadly, if these individuals have peers that support this, like in some of the cases of the school shooting, it can go to that step. So I do think violent video games can be something in the mix, and this is where the research, I think, there is research on violent video games. And if you study that research, what you would find is it often doesn't show an effect. But here's my contention. Why it doesn't show an effect is because very rarely is dose considered. In other words, if you have a son or daughter and they play violent video games an hour or two a day, and they've got a girlfriend and they got friends and they talk to you and they're doing well in school and they play sports, that's very different than if you have or someone has a child who doesn't have any of those other protective factors and is spending 8 hours. And the other thing research doesn't control for is mental illness. Because when they do these research, it's often done in schools. Now, what do you know if the child's in school? It's already a good thing, right? He or she, Johnny or Sally's in school. Some of these kids who are involved in violent imagery, if they're not in school and they have a mental illness, they're not part of those studies. So I would not implicate violent video games, but I would say what one wants to look at is what other protective factors are in the child's life and how absorbed that child is, and does he or she have a mental health diagnosis, specifically a major affective disorder. So I appreciate the question. Excellent question. Thank you.
I was just wondering, for the severely abused parasite offenders, are there actually programs that they can be referred to when they do go into the jail system to deal with their victimisation and trauma? Or is the program that they're just sentenced to life and don't have one?
Excellent question, and I appreciate the question. Sadly, I can only draw on my experience. Judges in a number of my cases have specifically recognized this and have ordered treatment. But the problem is, in our prison systems, rarely is treatment provided of the magnitude they need. Now, they would have to make a request to go see the counselor or the psychologist or whatever. And over time, they've become somewhat prisonized, and they're afraid to do that. They're afraid because they think that their confidence won't be respected. So the reality is these kids rarely get help in prison, and they often, because they're criminally unsophisticated, they may become victimized. So I've had kids who've traded abuse at home now for abuse in prison. And, to give an example of a kid that comes to mind, he was sexually assaulted in prison. He didn't tell me, but I look at the medical records, and I can tell from the medical records the nature of the injuries is consistent with a violent sexual battery. Let me just say one quick thing, because I know we have to close, and it's responsive to the woman's question on battered children. That rarely works, too. And it's not because these kids, people don't think are battered, but the way the self-defense laws work in our country, probably not different from many countries, you have to be in fear of imminent death or physical injury, and it has to be reasonable. And when these kids aggress, if they've been abused and it's been of a nature that's been very violent and they're in fear of their lives, when they have attacked the abusive parent is when they perceive they had an opportunity to prevail. So it's a non-confrontive situation. The parent might be sleeping. The parent might be, as in the case of Peter Jones, he's watching television, so Peter's out there, the father's this way, and doesn't see Peter coming to shoot him. So the non-confrontive nature of the situations when these kids aggress is why that the battered child syndrome is often would not excuse them. If they killed when the parent was assaulting them, that would be different. But they tend to kill when they perceive that they would overcome the what they consider the assailant.
I'm just wondering what you think the significance might have been with the Sandy Hook killer, that the first person he chose to kill was his mother.
Yeah. Excellent question. I suspect, and of course we'll never know, it's an excellent question, that this child, or he's not a child, he was 21, but young man, was so full of rage. And whether he killed his mom to protect her, it's possible, but he did shoot her in the face. And so, and this is no commentary on the mom. The mom was a very loving, from all accounts, mother was very loving. So I suspect it was rage, and then to go to a school and to mow down first graders, to me, is indicative of somebody seriously disturbed and enraged. So that's, the best I can say on that. Now, we've had several cases of school shooters in our country who have killed parents, and looking at those cases, a couple of them are still alive. In the cases I'm thinking about, one killed because of rage, again, towards the mom, who was reportedly psychologically abusive. Who knows? But I mean, not physically, but psychologically abusive. The other one killed That was Luke Whittam. The other one, Kip Kingle, killed his parents because he knew what he was going to do, go to the school, and didn't want them reportedly to suffer. So again, we're looking at people whose thinking is seriously disturbed. Excellent question, though. Did
Okay.
you have a thought on that, ma'am? What you were thinking? No. Yeah.
She had been a teacher, hadn't she?
Yes. Well, they said, from what I can discern, that she had done volunteer work, so there was an association exactly with the school, and so it may have been obliterating. Some have speculated he may have been jealous of the attention, but from all accounts that I could see, the mom was very involved. Sadly, what the mom did, we didn't talk too much about risk factors, but I've seen this. The mom, boy, goes back to that gentleman's question, was absorbed in violent video games, so that's a risk factor. And he also liked firearms, and she not only bought him firearms, but took him to the range and practiced with him. She believed in the Second Amendment. But when you have a child who has some serious mental health issues, engaging that child in firearms or swords is probably, in my estimation, is not a wise thing to do. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think they're agreeing with that.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I guess from my perspective, I mean, Kathleen's talk really illustrates the real entrenched sadness, but also trauma that
Yes.
these kids are experiencing. Also, that these cases, though few in percentage terms, are truly unforgettable. And you know, we all have seen the high-profile cases. There's other ones as well. I know when I used to work in juvenile corrections, I still remember dealing with 12-year-olds who killed their step-parents, and I still, you know, don't forget those kids. So the other important message is opportunities to scaffold and put some prevention around all of our kids may well make a difference for their future and in the community. So, colleagues, please join me in thanking Professor Heide for that great presentation.
Thank you very much. Pleasure. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, Paul. It's a pleasure.